Oversimplifying Spanish grammar can actually help you speak better as long as you do it right. Let's talk about how to make complex grammar topics in Spanish much easier to master by oversimplifying them. We'll also talk about how to use oversimplification to speak with more accurate Spanish, not less accurate. And we'll cover how to avoid a trap that many students fall into where you oversimplify in the wrong way and end up with some really bad habits that are hard to break. Let's just dive in. So the basic idea here is that we're dropping concepts in Spanish into buckets that native speakers do. So for example, very often when you hear people talking about ser versus estar, we're talking about essential characteristics versus non-essential characteristics. You'll also hear people grouping subjunctive versus non-subjunctive into groups where you're saying subjunctive is for things that are uncertain, and the non-subjunctive normal tense is for things that are certain. And for people who have spoken Spanish their whole lives, all of these things do seem really simple and natural, and they're able to, give you some buckets that they think work. The problem is that oversimplifying it in certain ways just doesn't work for English speakers. Now, this particular video is not supposed to be all about subjunctives, but I do want to let you know that over time, I systematically learned the rules for subjunctives. There are certain sentence templates that do trigger the subjunctive, and they include specific rules. And all of that is to say that the oversimplification that I was given didn't really work. I had to find a different framework that did work. And today I'm not really going to dive into these sentence templates, but I can dive into the subjunctive and when to predict it more in another video if you like. Just leave a comment and let me know. For today, I want to home in on the idea of oversimplification and how dropping concepts into buckets can actually be helpful if you find the right buckets to drop things into. And to give you a quick win with this, I'm going to focus on one really helpful example, specifically por versus para, when they're translated as for. We'll get into that example in a minute with some quick hacks that you can use to use por and para more accurately. But let's talk about the way that we do this effectively. So let's say that there are any two things you have trouble choosing between in Spanish. Some common ones are por versus para, ser versus estar, cual versus que, and bien versus bueno. The first step is to find a general rule that applies most of the time. And it's really important to get that rule right because you do want it to be something that applies most of the time. Then beyond that, you're going to start practicing a whole bunch of different cases of choosing between those two things. And whenever you're getting it wrong, whenever it's not intuitive which bucket to drop the thing into, you kind of have to just go, well, that's just how Spanish works. But here's the thing about saying, well, that's just how Spanish works. If you don't have buckets that work most of the time, you're going to be saying, well, that's just how Spanish works. So often, you're just going to be saying that constantly, which can be really frustrating and slow down your journey to speaking well in Spanish. So our purpose here is to find the right shortcut or the right rule of thumb that works most of the time, and then develop the nuance from there. And one of my favorite simple examples of this is por versus para, which is a topic we've helped tens of thousands of people break through for the first time. These words give English speakers so much trouble because, well, in the first place, they're prepositions, and prepositions just don't translate between any two languages. But specifically, both of these prepositions are often translated as for in English. So for English speakers, translating the word for into Spanish as either por or para can be really difficult. So here are the two buckets that we tend to give our students. When the word for is used in English as a preposition, it usually means one of two things, either intended for or because of. The word por in Spanish means because of, and the word para means intended for. So here's some really simple examples. First of all, this is for you. When I say for there, that could be replaced with intended for. This is intended for you. That's para. Esto es para ti. Next, how about this one? It happened for that reason. Did it happen intended for that reason? No, it happened because of that reason. It happened por that reason, or pasó por esa razón. Next, they have something for my mom. They have something intended for my mom. So they have something para mi mamá. And then one more simple example, they paid him for his work. They didn't pay him intended for his work. That would be weird. They paid him because of his work, or por his work. Le pagaron por su trabajo. So these are some very simple examples where you can very easily put the things in one bucket or the other based on whether it's intended for or because of. You can even stop this video right now and just go out and try this. Anytime you say for in English as a preposition, see if you can replace it with intended for or because of. And pretty much 90% of the time, you'll know whether that would be translated as para or por. But now let's talk about some of the nuanced situations where it's not really clear which way it would go because the word for in English doesn't easily translate to one of those terms, intended for or because of. So here's an example. The love that I feel for my dog. So what does the term for mean there? Is it the love that I feel intended for my dog? Or is it the love that I feel because of my dog? Well, for whatever reason, the Spanish translation of that phrase is el amor que siento por mi perro. And that's because in Spanish, when you feel something for someone, the sense is that you're feeling it because of them. So that's pretty much always going to be por. And this is an example where we just kind of have to drop things into buckets. We drop a feeling that you have for someone or something into the por bucket, labeled as the because of bucket. Here's another example that's not very intuitive. I did it for her. So did I do it intended for her, or did I do it because of her? It's not very clear. Personally, by default, I would think that I'm doing it intended for her. So let's say I'm doing some sort of work on her behalf. I'm doing the work para her, right? But no, actually, the idiomatic translation in Spanish is I did it por her. So we're going to drop that in the because of bucket. When you do something on someone's behalf, you're doing it por them or because of them. But something that's very interesting is that it's also very common to say lo hice para ella, specifically when you're doing something or more often making something that is intended for someone. So for example, I made these things for her. Hice estas cosas para ella. So as you can see, hacer is sometimes used with por and sometimes used with para. But these buckets are still useful because you have sort of a mental model. You have a label that you can place on por, meaning because of, and para, meaning intended for, and then apply those labels to specific situations. Then as time goes by, you'll learn more and more situations in Spanish that are used in very rare cases where it's unintuitive which one of them you'd use, but now you have a bucket to drop it into as a habit. Now, before we go, I want to emphasize again how important it is to get the right oversimplification, one that's going to work most of the time. So you want to get those labels on the bucket right. And this is unfortunately a mistake that I think most Spanish learners and even most Spanish teachers get wrong when it comes to ser versus estar. So many teachers and learners put the labels permanent on the ser bucket and temporary on the estar bucket. Those labels are not useful. So for example, the location of a city, like Buenos Aires está en Argentina, that's estar, even though it's clearly permanent. And then what time it is, like it's 5 o'clock or it's 7:30, that's always ser, even though time, by its very nature, is always a temporary thing. A more useful label for the ser and estar buckets is what it is versus how or where it is. So Buenos Aires está en Argentina. That's how or where it is. It's 7:30. That's what it is. Just fixing those labels on your buckets is going to help you with ser and estar 90% of the time or more. So whenever you're trying to figure out how to oversimplify your Spanish grammar, I recommend consulting with native speakers and specifically with experts who have taught Spanish and done it very well so that you can determine which rules to follow for oversimplifying. The good news is that we've done the work for you, so you don't have to go out and hire a consultant to do this. The LearnCraft Spanish curriculum has all of the oversimplified rules that you need to learn 90% of the Spanish language, and it's available online for free. We have rules for ser versus estar, with hundreds and hundreds of practice examples for you to quiz yourself with. We have rules for por versus para. We have the buckets you can put subjunctives into, including all the sentence templates that you need to practice using the subjunctive. And you can find all of this just by going to SpanishVideoCourse.com or by listening to the entire curriculum on the LearnCraft Spanish podcast. Just search for LearnCraft Spanish wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're having trouble specifically with ser and estar, we're about to publish some really handy videos to help you practice putting ser and estar in the right buckets. If you want to practice choosing between ser and estar and finally perfect them like thousands of our students have done, just subscribe to this channel and we'll show you those videos as soon as they come out.